I've made a vocabulary table today involving a word of vocabulary, the foreign language, using that word in an example sentence, and then the English. This isn't just any list of vocabulary, it's the vocabulary of a short story. Yesterday, I made a short story by using AI. I uploaded a video about it, and I thought it was 1,000 words or more, but it's actually 615, something like that. And when I was reading through it, some of the vocabulary was difficult vocabulary for when I will translate it from English into the foreign language for my studying as a learning material. So I used an AI prompt to tell it to simplify the story vocabulary, and I will show you some of those prompts now. I said in Grok, I will paste in a story. Could you give me a synopsis of the story, please, using simple vocabulary because I'm not an advanced reader. A synopsis is an even shorter version of the story, a summary rather than the story itself, because I thought I'd really like the ability to state the story as a summary. So I was interested in the vocabulary that would be involved in that. And then I said, could you simplify the vocabulary of the story, please? Because I am not an advanced reader. Um, it did that, but then I wanted the specifics of what it changed. So I asked, which bits did you simplify? And it listed what it simplified. Um, and then, and think that occurred as a table. And then I said, could you give me a vocabulary list of the words which were either removed or altered? Because not only do I want a list of the current words of the current shortened story, but I also want a knowledge of the difficult, more challenging words. In that way, I can have study of the simpler story as I learn, and then at some time in the future, I could study the more complicated version of the story and read its vocabulary list before I then read it. Then I ask how many words were there originally compared with now, and it cut the size down from about 600 words to 400 and something. So it cut about 20 to 25%, I think. With the simpler story, could you make a vocabulary list in alphabetical order, please? And an example sentence for each word or phrase. If any words from the synopsis are not in the simpler story, then could you list those as well, please, plus an example sentence? So that's how I created the example sentences, which I showed you at the start of the video. I just then needed a prompt to create that nice looking table. It got a bit complicated then because when it was making the table, it was writing it in this HTML style, and I had to use a download icon in a nice way. If I used the copy to clipboard, what it copied was that strange HTML, the code, this thing, whereas this actually made a readable table. But the prompt for making this table was a lot more complicated than I anticipated. But the prompt which worked in the end was something a bit like this. I pasted in my vocabulary that had the example sentences. I told it to translate it into the foreign language, but it wasn't doing it properly. So then I added to the prompt how I want it as a left column and right column. And then um, in order to do this, make a readable normal table and types see English in a row beneath each Polish row. Could you display the entire table as a web page, please? That didn't really go anywhere. So I think the prompt for doing it is this, or very similar to this original story. And then I've got this synopsis, which I could translate into a foreign language as well by using a prompt. I've got my simpler story, which is 400 or so words. And before I come to read this shorter story, I want to be very good at the vocabulary which the story is made up of. And that's when I would be studying these sentence examples. What was very good about the adventure story prompting from yesterday was that I designed it in a way that a new adventure story could be written using the same prompts, and it does a bit of randomization. Oh, the other thing I did was add into the story a specific vocabulary list of words which I wanted to learn. So what I can do is I can reuse my story creating prompt and introduce into it a new list of vocabulary that has to occur in the story. And then I can create a new vocabulary list, new sentence list. And I think this will be a nice organic way of gradually building up my vocabulary knowledge. I should say that I already do know quite a lot of vocabulary loosely, so I'm not sure how a complete beginner would use this. I think a complete beginner probably need simpler learning materials before using this approach, but then it could be similar sentence lists and a story that uses these words, but just that the story is much, much simpler. In closing, I just want to say that this has been harder to do than I thought it would be. Quite often, the AI assumes that I don't want words like and, it, etc. In the word lists that I'm asking for, and I do. And in a blur, it states what it is including and what it isn't including. But I don't notice that because I'm so busy looking at the list output being created. And then I only realize later that it has left out a lot of vocabulary. So I still have work to do. I need to do some of these word lists again. I'll show you where I got to with my prompts near the end. One thing I wanted to do was to make the vocabulary example sentences to limit themselves to vocabulary from my small vocabulary list. So if you've been watching my earlier video or videos this week, you know that I have a vocabulary list which I've forced into the adventure story. And the whole aim was to practice these vocabulary words by embedding them in an adventure story. So what I did was I went back to some of the work I was doing today and I said, there is a vocabulary list named vocabulary list X, and I pasted it in. And then instead of my older prompt, I said that I wanted the simpler story to have its vocabulary listed as a vocabulary list with example sentences, including words from the synopsis that were not already known, and keep the example sentences simple. And here's the important bit. The example sentences should include words from vocabulary list X where possible, rather than introducing additional vocabulary. With hindsight, I'm not so bothered about the synopsis words now. It was a nice idea, but it's excessive, I think. But this prompt was quite good. except that I realized that I shouldn't have talked about the simpler story. I really wanted to get a big word list for the main story, the big story. So I rephrased it to make the Polish English table. I used this prompt here, which worked very well. In conclusion, I think that this is a good technique for learning vocabulary because having the simpler, shorter story really reduces the vocabulary that needs to be learned. Having example sentences is good, and the fact that the example sentences don't introduce unnecessarily extra vocabulary, I think that's very good. And what I would like to do when I perfect this is put the example sentences into an AI audio generator so that I can have listening practice as well as the ability to read the sentences. And I would like to put both the short and simplified story and the main story into an audio generator as well. And then I can have listening practice. I also want to continue with my plan of storyboarding as images uh, all the parts of the story so that I could have an audio visual display where I listen to the story and I see images consistent with the story, a bit like a comic book. And maybe in the future, I would use those as the image to video prompts so that an AI could actually make an animation.